welcome to the show. Welcome to Last Chance to See Daniel Denvir. He's the host of a great podcast called The Dig. He's an organizer. He's if you're not familiar with his work, you should make yourself familiar because he's the Dig is incredible. It feels like more than a podcast. It's an educational project. I've learned a lot from it. I'm sure a lot of people on the left have learned a lot from it. And I mean, I've learned a lot from Daniel's wonderful book, All American Nativism. And I wanted to have him on to kind of discuss this present moment we're in with immigration, because his book came out in 2020. And I would say things have changed since then somewhat dramatically. And I want to kind of talk where we go from here, especially as there's more energy around progressive candidates. People have their eyes on the 2026 midterms, but I think people have a great deal of maybe anxiety, excitement, whatever you would call it, about 2028 and hopefully ushering in a new era. And so I wanted to kind of talk to someone who has worked so closely with this issue on how we talk about immigration. So thank you for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, glad to be here.
All of that I'm alluding to, and maybe you disagree with this, but for me, it kind of feels like it feels as if immigration is maybe a bit more of a unique topic than some of the other topics that progressive candidates might talk about. I think when you're talking about, at the very least, I would say there's not it doesn't seem like there's a cohesive progressive immigration platform. There's certainly not a slogan people can get behind. There's, with all these other things, I think they just make sense on the face of people. Medicare for all, we're doing single payer healthcare. It's going to change my life. Labor protections. I'm going to have more power at work. All of these things.
Abolish ICE might be making a comeback. It was coined by one of the more annoying people in the universe, Sean McElwee. But I think increasingly the idea that ICE needs to go, that the fact that we spent the last 2.5 decades building up a giant federal police force to target immigrants, and now that federal police force is being operationalized by a fascist authoritarian regime to not only persecute migrants, but as sort of a Praetorian guard at his direction to repress internal dissent. I mean, I think that tells us a lot about the fact that from the get-go, anti-immigrant politics have been about supposedly protecting us from the other, while actually building up this massive architecture of repression that can be used against Americans. But yeah, I mean, I think that opposition to ICE, confrontations with ICE, resistance of ICE incursions, ICE raids, federal occupations, I think that this is kind of the crux of the struggle for immigrant rights at the moment. But you're right, there is no cohesive or broadly consented to program for immigrant rights for the left if we were to exercise, governing power in this country. And I think we urgently need to be thinking about what that would look like, because there's also a lot of confusion about what is not only what is ethical, but what's politically practical.
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it. Right? I think we can all say, hey, we're for open borders. This is the ethical thing to do. But I don't think. I think voters are going to kind of look at you and go, "What are you talking about?" I think ideally, what we'd have is a lot of people reading books like yours that people are writing and really have a full picture of what American immigration is and where it came from, but I think we have to meet people where we are. And I don't know exactly what that looks like. I haven't seen someone emerge with a full-scale platform.
I think it was in 2019 that I wrote an op-ed for the New York Times that made the case for more open borders. Obviously, if, I believe that if one is a socialist of some sort, then our ideal should be a world that fully guarantees people's freedom of movement. So yes, a world without any border controls, but I also believe in a world where the means of production are fully socialized and under popular democratic control. I don't believe that we win the governing power that we need to begin concretely transforming this world to the better through slogans like open borders or socialize the means of production. Not that we should be afraid of talking about those on podcasts or talking about that in books and articles and in meetings. It's not like we should, pretend that we don't believe these things. But are those the sort of campaigns that can win durable public majorities across this country? Definitely not. But we can we take this, the fact that we have historic support for immigration right now in this country as a reaction to Trump's horrific repression? Can we do something with that? Can we push for more open borders? Yes. Would that also need to be paired if the left were truly governing this country with an effort to guarantee people's right to not migrate and stay put? Because that's the flip side. People should have the right to move where they want or need to go in the world. And they should also have the right to a secure, dignified home where they are, if that's what they want. And right now we have a imperialist world capitalist system that systematically destabilizes people's lives all over the world. Whether we're talking about war in all of the places that Western imperialism has destabilized across the Middle East, whether we're talking about climate change in the Western highlands of Guatemala, whether we are talking about the U.S. economic sanctions that have played a preponderant role in destroying Venezuela's economy. Not the only role. I'm not a fan of Maduro, but the Washington Post investigated this and very clearly found that, U.S. sanctions were decisive in cracking Venezuela's economy, which sent Venezuelan migrants all over Latin America and to the United States. There are reasons that people migrate, and we need just as we need to have a politics, if we are to achieve governing power, that increase people's freedom of movement, we also need a politics that increases people's right to stay home. That's all part of what it would mean to be free, that people can go if they want and stay if they want. And in that sense, the right to migrate is fundamentally tied up in the general politics of human freedom that implicates foreign policy, geopolitics, geoeconomics, everything, and will require an end to the neoliberal world capitalist system, an end to imperialism, and a global program that allows countries across the global South to sustainably develop their economies, especially in the face of climate catastrophe.
Yeah, I mean that's kind of what worries me a little bit too is that I almost worry it's like this insurmountable thing where, you bring up Venezuela. I think a lot of Americans were probably watching the news with bated breath yesterday, wondering if...
very disturbing.
Yeah. And it almost feels like... It almost feels difficult to for progressives to talk about and tackle without a commitment to taking on the national security state, the this massive apparatus of foreign policy that is just entrenched from centuries of this. It almost sometimes reminds me of, I'm sure you're familiar with some of these examples of like progressive candidates who win and then get, what's a good example of, it happens often with like progressive DAs, because sometimes people will say there's no such thing, but like a Chesa Boudin or even George Gascon here in LA, it's...
Or my friend Larry Craster in Philadelphia.
Yeah, it's... You're tasked with this impossible thing. You're trying to have a more compassionate criminal justice system when what it really necessitates is this kind of broad, all-encompassing strategy.
Right. That's why a progressive DA can get a lot done, and people should not say it's not worth running progressive DAs for office, because if a standard issue Philadelphia district attorney was in office instead of Larry Krasner, untold, and I'm sure we could make statistical projections actually, and maybe someone has, huge numbers of people who are not in prison right now would be in prison. That said, any progressive DA's job, whether in Philly or LA or when Chesa was in San Francisco, their job is still every day putting people in prison. In large numbers of them, larger numbers than should be going to prison, in a country where one of our defining characteristics as a country, if you were looking down on us from Mars, is that we incarcerate just an extraordinary number of people. It's one of the defining issues of our country. There's we take it for granted, but it's one of the things that is most peculiar about the organization of our society. But you can only, so a progressive DA, on the one hand, is an important reform, can advance important reforms that begin to reduce the size and scope of the carceral state in a city like LA or Philadelphia. But are they going to end mass incarceration? No. Is Zoran going to end mass incarceration as the person ultimately overseeing the NYPD, the largest police force in this country? No. But what his community safety proposal intends to do is to take a substantial chunk of social phenomena that are currently within the purview of the carceral state and remove them from the carceral state. That's a victory in and of itself if he pulls it off. If while doing that, he can also improve general social conditions by creating universal childcare, expanding public transit, making people's housing more secure by freezing the rent and rent-stabilized units. If we can reduce the size of the carceral state and expand the size of the scope of the social state simultaneously, that's what the abolition of the carceral state, it's going to require that sort of process of investing in the good stuff and divesting from the bad stuff over a substantial period of time. We're not experiencing anything close to revolutionary conditions in this country. And if we're serious about combating the carceral state, of which the anti-immigrant state is a core part, then we need to think about non-reformist reforms that can gradually but decisively check and reduce its size, scope, and power. And that's how we need to think about progressive DAs, Zoran being mayor, or one day, hopefully not too long, someone with Zoran's politics being president. Like, if someone with Zoran's politics becomes president, I think we, as a left, should immediately demand an end to imperialism in terms of like invading other people's countries. Like, we don't want non-reformist reforms on that. We just want that not to happen. We want military aid to Israel to be cut off. Like, there are certain things that can and should just happen like that. But a socialist president of the United States, elected under socio-political conditions that are somewhat like the conditions that we currently live under, is not going to be able to flip a switch to end U.S. imperialism either. Again, can end it and stop invading other countries type ways. But imperialism and colonialism are baked into the entire U.S.-dominated world system. So ending that actually also requires a series of non-reformist reforms as well. It's all like extraordinarily complex, particularly because, again, we just are not living in a revolutionary situation. If conditions changed and we're ripe for revolutionary tactics, then we can have a new discussion. We need what Stuart Hall called a Marxism without guarantees. We should all be very serious about rigorous assessment of the conjuncture that we live in and what sort of strategy and tactics can move us across the terrain that we find ourselves on in a way that can further transform the terrain in the favor of our politics. But we can't have a politics that just says, let's do the good thing. Let's make the world good and not bad. That really doesn't tell us very much how to do it and how to actually move forward, which is like where the real challenge is.
In your book, you kind of you have this this argument that, you know, this has been a bipartisan effort, which a lot of things that have felt aberrational in the Trump years have, if you go back, have been a bipartisan effort. And, you know, you kind of argue that, and your book came out during Trump 1, so obviously didn't see the Trump 2 era. Trump 2, I think a lot of people maybe didn't see coming. Just if people haven't really been paying attention, it's obviously been a wild escalation with, you know, just recently $170 billion to federal anti-immigrant enforcement, with a lot of that going to ICE and Border Patrol. You know, so there's policy elements and then just kind of cultural things that I'm sure you're aware of, like the Department of Homeland Security just kind of fully posting like basically white supremacist imagery.
Yeah. It really just is really straight up Nazi stuff they're posting over there.
Yeah, it's I mean, it's very alarming.
They know what they're doing.
Yeah, and it's obviously opened up it's opened up culture in a way that I think you're seeing people say things publicly that I don't think they would have been comfortable with just a short time ago. I mean, the one that comes to mind is that clip of Mehdi Hassan on that Jubilee show where he's just surrounded by basically white supremacists, and they're just fully asserting that they are indigenous to American land. And then, yeah, all the policy stuff where you're just seeing the most horrific ICE arrest disrupting school, children, teachers. It's, you know, parents are obviously going through hell. Does this moment feel like an aberration to you, or just kind of the next logical step in this horrific march towards whatever this is?
I think so many struggles over how to interpret Trumpism basically come down to how people are thinking about sort of rupture versus continuity. And I think that I would argue that we both need to assess Trump as a dramatic break, in the sense that, especially Trump 2.0, in the sense that he has the Trump administration now has a very clear and serious politics to break from liberal democratic norms and make our system increasingly authoritarian, one where popular elections perhaps do not decide the outcomes of election, perhaps do not decide who is in power, where media outlets are increasingly under the direct sway of the regime, where the presidency is instrumentalized in the pursuit of private profit, where, if they can get away with it, where political opponents are incarcerated. That would be, all of those things are where they are where we already are to some extent, or where they would like to take us. And I think people on the left are now all in pretty clear agreement under Trump 2.0 that all of these things, either in kind or degree, pretty radical departures. At the same time, Trump is fundamentally continuous with ordinary American bipartisan politics at their most ordinary and at their worst. As you mentioned, in terms of bipartisanship, it's not just immigration. It's the war on terror. It's the war on crime. It's the war on drugs. And it is the war on immigrants. And all of these wars have all been extraordinarily bipartisan affairs. And all of them, in particular, these wars are the regular American politics, the ordinary American politics as usual, that created Trumpism. If you look at the war on migrants, for example, you can draw a direct line, which is what my book does, from the early 1990s to Trump's 2016 victory. You can draw a direct line from Bill Clinton and congressional Republicans cooperating to militarize the border, to increasingly enmesh immigration enforcement with this country's gargantuan criminal justice system. A direct line from there through George W. Bush and congressional Democrats like Barack Obama and Joe Biden and Hillary Clinton passing the Secure Fence Act in 2007 or 2008, which led to the construction of hundreds of miles of border wall. Border fence in many places, it looked exactly like what Trump would later call a wall. A direct line from there through Obama's Secure Communities program, which meant that every single fingerprint taken in a local police station anywhere in this country was run by ICE. You can draw a direct line through all of that to Trump descending his elevator and announcing his campaign, calling Mexicans rapists and criminals, and declaring that we needed a border wall because there had been a process of continuous escalation of enforcement and militarization. Each moment of escalation, of intensification of enforcement, promising that the border would finally be secured, that so-called illegal immigration would finally end, and fundamentally really promising that Americans would be secure and okay. Like, beyond immigration, what are these politics trying to do? They're trying to promise to people, beyond the issue of immigration, you will be secure. You will be okay. Not just in terms of immigration, but generally. And guess what? Not only was the border not secure, not only did quote-unquote illegal immigration not end, but Americans were not secure or okay. In fact, Americans were feeling less and less and less okay as decades of neoliberalism continued to immiserate them. And so by the time Trump announced his campaign for office, the logical escalation was Mexicans are rapists and criminals, and we need a border wall to keep them out. That is where the bipartisan anti-immigrant politics of the Clinton, W. Bush, and Obama years had left things. And you could make similar sorts of arguments around the war on crime and the war on terror and the war on drugs. And in fact, all four of these are all fundamentally enmeshed with each other. And my book's really about all of them in a way that's you cannot disentangle. For example, after 9/11, the politics of border security, which had already intensified so dramatically throughout the 1990s, intensified throughout the 90s in principally to redirect anxiety and anger around free trade and NAFTA away from capital moving across borders and to people moving across borders. That is suddenly overlaid with the war on terror, the idea that any single person who crosses the border illegally might not just be an undocumented immigrant, they might be a terrorist. And from the moment that the war on terror happens, the border becomes securitized in this newly global militaristic way, politically, and then practically, you have the entire reorganization under the Department of Homeland Security of immigration enforcement. So it literally, as a practical institutional matter, immigration enforcement becomes institutionally part of this Homeland Security apparatus. And it's an apparatus that's growing dramatically. We go from just a few thousand, maybe 2,000-3,000, I don't have the numbers in front of me, Border Patrol agents in the early 1990s to roughly 20,000 today. The number of INS officers then to ICE officers today, also a dramatic explosion, and continues to explode now thanks to the One Big Beautiful Bill. There is, we could talk about the war in Iraq and Afghanistan and how the neoconservative promise there to liberate the Muslim world from tyranny, as absurd as that is, that actually does legitimate the war on terror in its early years. And when the United States fails to achieve its stated aims in the war on terror, when instead of being greeted as liberators in Iraq and Afghanistan, it's greeted with years of intense insurgency, Islamophobia in the U.S. dramatically intensifies. It dramatically, and this is an important thing people don't know, but it's something very important that I discovered researching the book. People always talk about the Islamophobia that followed the 9/11 attacks. And there was Islamophobia, no doubt, that followed the 9/11 attacks. But polls make it very clear that the American public became much more broadly Islamophobic and much more intensely Islamophobic, not after 9/11, but after the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq had clearly failed in the mid to late aughts. So all of these things, this is the history. This is the history of Trumpism before we knew that it was Trumpism. It's all of these politics that coalesce into MAGA.
I like what you said about this. You point out this kind of desire for safety and security that just cannot be guaranteed. You actually have a quote in your book. It says, "This is the basic paradox at the heart of U.S. immigration politics. The border has never been more militarized, our prisons never more full, and our military never more hopelessly entangled, yet a vocal minority of Americans have become apoplectically adamant that our nation is insecure, inside and out, and vulnerable to threats foreign and domestic." And, I think that's very true, and I think that's where a lot of this comes from. They're obviously playing to people's fears. And pushing through. It seems like there's no way to go but forward. Sometimes it's just keep upping the ante, keep relentlessly moving forward and militarizing, because at least if you're moving in that direction, you're assuaging those concerns. How do you make sure you're taking people's concerns seriously? And because I don't think it's just safety too, right? There's all kinds of threats. There's economic threats. I think people are worried about scarcity in this country. You saw it massively with just the shutdown, where the whole thing was about how, we're actually going to bat for you. Yes, we're taking away your health care, but it's because we'd rather die than give it to an undocumented immigrant or something like that. So I think that just plays into this thing where it's just it becomes very difficult to talk about on the left when those concerns are so easy to tap into with the right.
A bunch of things to say here. I mean, one, it's, the reason that Democrats like Harris, Biden, like Obama, like Bill Clinton, one of the main reasons that they embrace different forms of anti-migrant politics is they say, Republicans are capitalizing on this issue. If we are anti-migrant, but in a less extreme way, this is Clintonian triangulation, we can diffuse the appeal of this anti-migrant poll and beat them. But that's not what happens. Actually, what happens when Democrats do this is they ratify the premise of the right-wing argument that immigration is a problem, that border insecurity is a problem. And it's a problem so major that it requires major things. And if you ratify the premise that immigration is a problem and border insecurity is a problem, and I'm a voter who now believes this, immigration and border security are big problems. Wow. Even though the Democrats are saying, I'm going to secure the border, I'm going to deport the immigrants, if the Democrats and Republicans combined, if the fact that they are agreeing, I'm getting messaging from both of them affirming this idea that immigration and border insecurity are these giant issues, I'm going to go with the real deal, the person who is going to do border security and immigration enforcement in the most hardcore manner. So what Democrats are inadvertently, I say inadvertently, but they really should know better right now. So I'll put an asterisk on that adjective. What they are inexplicably still doing at this point is ratifying the premises of their opponent's argument in a way that raises the salience of an issue beneficial to their opponent, i.e. the Republicans. And so that's one thing to say. Another thing to say is, I mentioned the war on drugs, the war on terror, and I mentioned NAFTA. Protecting the onset of border militarization in the 90s was in so many ways on a political level fundamentally about protecting NAFTA, redirecting anger away from the free movement of capital under neoliberal free trade agreements to the free movement of people, i.e. particularly undocumented Mexican migrants at that point in time. So there is a class politics to the politics of migration always. It's very clear in the 1990s. It's also very clear in the wake of the global financial crisis when the Great Recession hits. And the first major response in U.S. politics to that is the Tea Party, which starts with a libertarian agenda, with an anti-regulation, anti-welfare, anti-bailing out poor people, whatever. Like, it's seen initially as overwhelmingly concerned with a far-right economic agenda. But very interestingly, very quickly, the Tea Party becomes, above all else, even more than economic issues, focused on anti-immigrant politics and becomes core to SB 1070, the Arizona bill passed in 2010, the so-called Show Me Your Papers law, that is the sort of like resurrection of the most draconian anti-migrant politics of 5 years prior with the Sensenbrenner bill. But anyhow, so with SB 1070 and this being the big thing of the Tea Party, we see that like the economic reaction from the right to the financial crisis is fundamentally about anti-immigrant politics. And why? Well, because right-wing class politics are always going to be about dividing the working class against itself. Functionally, it must be so. And one of the key ways the working class is divided against itself is through racism in general and nativist anti-migrant politics in particular. So so much of the politics around immigration are really about can't stop with immigration. They have to go deeper and go into a contestation of the very construction of what are the problems, what are the deep problems facing society themselves. And our job as the left is to point to other things.
Yeah, I mean, would the Republicans' argument that immigrants are taking your health care be so effective if we just had a comprehensive single-payer healthcare system in this country that people would go, well, what's supposed to impact me? I go to the doctor, it's free. I don't, sure, there might be a couple people who are like, I don't want my taxes to be higher. But my hope is that people would be a bit less affected by that. I also want to put a finer point on some of those, with you talking about Democrats kind of meeting Republicans and people just going, well, why don't I just go for the real thing? Yeah, for the real deal. 2024 is kind of like a perfect epilogue to your book where you just kind of have this almost parody of a Democratic immigration platform where you have Kamala Harris putting forth a pretty strange platform considering her past positions. She once called Trump's wall policy un-American and a medieval vanity project, and she was now pledging to spend hundreds of millions of dollars on a southern wall. She called it, she said Trump's border wall is a complete waste of taxpayer money and won't make us any safer. Said it was a stupid use of money. I will block any funding for it. And, just obviously was trying to play very tough on immigration. She started labeling herself as the, with her time as Attorney General of California as the kind of the border state prosecutor. And just her support for Border Patrol agents, all that.
Kamala Harris has spent decades fighting violent crime. As a border state prosecutor, she took on drug cartels and jailed gang members for smuggling weapons and drugs across the border. As vice president, she backed the toughest border control bill in decades. And as president, she will hire thousands more border agents and crack down on fentanyl and human trafficking. Fixing the border is tough. So is Kamala Harris.
I'm Kamala Harris, and I approve this message.
Obviously, it was a weird year. I mean, we didn't get a primary or anything like that. Do you think 2024 would have looked a little differently? Not only did we not get a primary, I know people like you were doing the very important work of trying to get any kind of movement from, or any kind of promise of some movement from this from her campaign. Yes, on Gaza. Do you think it would have looked different in a different year?
I mean, definitely. 2024 was a very bad moment for left power in the United States across the board. And I think the mainstream assessment, then there was just a big New York Times article that basically made this editorialized this point, this argument, which is that the mainstream assessment is basically that Biden, because of actually was too progressive on immigration, and thus allowed for this massive surge in irregular migration, which then inevitably led to voters souring on Biden-Harris and choosing Trump. It's obviously true that there were a lot of migrants entering the country last year, but compare the numbers of Venezuelan irregular migrants to the U.S. last year and the number of Ukrainian migrants who were legally resettled in the United States. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but a lot of Venezuelans crossed the border and a lot of Ukrainians crossed the border. There was no system in place to move Venezuelan migrants into the country in a way that they could go to a place where they would be welcomed, have a work permit expedited, fit into the social, political, economic fabric of the United States. That did not happen. They were dumped at the border, and then right-wing Republican governors, starting with Greg Abbott in Texas, or maybe it started with DeSantis, but I think it was Abbott first, and Abbott did the bulk of it, but Abbott and DeSantis started just busing huge numbers of migrants, many but not exclusively Venezuelan, from border states to Democratic cities like Chicago, New York, Denver, all over the place, where local mayors were suddenly forced to figure out what to do with all these homeless migrant people with no real federal support. The federal government did next to nothing to support these migrants, to coordinate their movements, to expedite work permits, to do any of the things that would have made those migrants' lives much easier and made their presence much less visible and much less disruptive. I mentioned Ukrainian refugees who were resettled. Something I think like 200,000 plus entered the United States after Russia's horrific invasion of Ukraine. Why is there no big controversy over Ukrainian migrants in this country? I mean, one point is, well, racism. They're white. But another point is that they were resettled in a coordinated way, got work permits, etc. They were not homeless in giant numbers on the streets of American cities. And so we obviously don't want to live in a world where millions of people are being forced from their homes across borders due to war and economic immiseration and climate catastrophe. But right now we do live in that world. And there are political policy choices that can be made that Biden did not make that could have made, yes, it's objectively difficult to deal with large numbers of migrants. They did not deal with them.
Can I ask you a question about that? So I was always, to be honest, like I don't follow like the numbers of migrants crossing the border that closely. I wasn't, I didn't know exactly how to feel about when Trump was blaming Biden for this mess and this massive amount of migrants and everything like that. Also, they were framing I'm sure you saw a lot of the framing was almost as if Joe Biden's policy was that we were now an open border country. Did Joe Biden have a did he have a vastly different border policy that I was unaware of? I was not aware that like he all of a sudden reversed course and somehow we just had an open border.
No, he did not. He did not open the border. People availed themselves of their asylum rights under U.S. and international law, which means that you can't just throw someone back from where they came from. But that's actually what anti-migrant critics of Biden says that he should have done, and that is essentially what Trump has done since.
Okay. So so they were just pushing him to kick people out who were claiming asylum. I know you have to. I know you'll have to get going soon. So the last thing I did want to talk to you about is just kind of this this new crop of progressive challengers. You know, like what would you, if you could talk to them and tell them how they should be positioning themselves on immigration, like what would you say? I mean, I told you a little bit about there was this Bernie Sanders clip from him. He was on the Tim Dillon show.
Has historically the United States done well under Democrats and Republicans in protecting the border? The answer is no. Trump did a better job. I don't like Trump, but we should have a secure border, and it ain't that hard to do. Biden didn't do it. Those before him did not do it. We should have a secure border, period. I think most people in the Congress agree with that.
Why don't you think he did it, just out of curiosity?
Pardon me?
Why don't you think Biden was more proactive with securing the border?
He did. He did some things. He was not, I think by the end of his term, if my memory is correct, the number of illegal folks coming in had gone down. But I'm not going to sit here and tell you that overall it was a good job. It was not. All right. So that's point number one. You need a border. Let's have a border. And we have certainly the technology and the manpower to make that happen.
It was alarming that, for all intents and purposes, Bernie Sanders is still the progressive leader in this country. He will not be running for president, I imagine. But it was alarming to see him kind of not have answers to Tim Dillon. And this new media space, people are, if they want to find success, are going to have to go into these podcast spaces to promote their own campaigns. And so I was just curious if you had any insight on what you would tell people, how they should be talking to people like this, who maybe are not aligned ideologically, but a little bit more open to heterodox candidates.
Yeah, I thought that interview sucked. I mean, Bernie has a incredibly important historic role as the key person who has revived the political power of the left in this country over the past decade, in particular, more than anyone else. And the basic framework of his sort of militant class struggle, social democratic socialist politics are still the created the template for everything we've seen since, from AOC through Zoran and beyond. And yet I think he would rather not talk about migration because he finds it inconvenient. And the problem is, like, you don't have to hand it to Trump on the border, actually, because what we've seen is that Trump's brutal repression has turned a majority of the public against his immigration agenda and led to all-time highs of Americans supporting immigrants, thinking immigrants are an important part of this country. So I think you can say something like, yeah, ideally we don't have like giant numbers of people irregularly showing up at the U.S. border, but that means we need more legal channels for people to migrate, and say, listen, we accepted, 200,000 plus Ukrainians and resettled them in an orderly manner across the United States. And they are now part of the fabric of this country. There's no reason we couldn't have done the same with Venezuelans, and we should have. And we should stop destabilizing all these different parts of the world so people don't feel forced to come here in the first place. But as long as they do, we need to make a place for them in this country. And in fact, a strong majority of Americans agree with me that immigrants are overwhelmingly net benefit to this country.
Yeah, I just saw the polling on that, actually. There was recent polling. I think maybe that's what you're referencing, where an overwhelming amount of Americans think immigration is a net positive. Not only that, but there's also massive disapproval of Trump's handling of immigration in this country. So there's a real reason to be optimistic that someone can come and take over this narrative, so we don't have to have this horrific regime.
And the thing is, we've never had an opposition party in this country articulate a robust pro-migrant platform. It's never been tried. So I think, given that we've seen throughout these decades of bipartisan anti-migrant politics, Democratic support for border militarization and immigration enforcement do nothing but strengthen the power and fuel the radicalization of the nativist right, I think, given that history, given that we know exactly what that does, that we ought to give full-throated backing of a pro-migrant platform as part of a generally transformative social democratic politics. I think we ought to give that a try. And polls suggest that not only do people like immigrants, a strong majority, but strong majorities like Medicare for all, majorities like a lot of our agenda. And I don't think we should pit immigration against, I don't think we should do this thing of pitting kind of immigration as an unpopular social issue or a controversial social issue against our popular universal class demands. That said, I think even while you make a full-throated case for the value of migration, you probably talk about raising the minimum wage and expanding social housing and enacting Medicare for all and taxing billionaires out of existence. You probably emphasize that the most. Like you do probably emphasize the class issues the most, because that you can't assume this kind of organically, homogenously, cohesively existing working class, but you can stitch one aspirationally into existence. And it is these big picture economic items that do the most to bring that class into existence.
Yeah, and I think the last part is just, I think your own argument of the fact that like these escalations just have not worked, I think is a great place to start.
The history is just inarguably clear. So let's try something different. I don't think it's without contradiction. I'm not pretending they're not challenges politically involved with hundreds of thousands or millions of people from other countries coming to this country. Like there clearly are, but we know we have a clear track record of one way of dealing with it. How about we try a different way? And when we get into power to try that different way, also try to really energetically figure out ways so people do not feel like they're forced to leave their home, so that when people come here, they come here of their own free will, and we welcome them with open arms.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a perfect place to leave it. I love that message. I think there's energy all around this country for people, people desperately wanting to try something new, and I hope we get to see that very soon. Do you want to take a second to plug anything or tell people where they can find you or anything
just
like that?
The podcast,
the Dig. We'll put links to the Dig. And Daniel, I appreciate you coming on. I appreciate all the work you do. It's very important, and appreciate your time.
Great. Thank you so much. Thanks, Emil.
Thank you.